I call this meeting to order. So we're now, it's great to see everybody. We're in meeting number 12 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. Today we'll be looking at the situation, the human rights situation in Iran. I just want to remind everybody, to all those present in the room, to just follow the recommendations from public health authorities, as well as the directives of the Board of Internal Economy, and to remain healthy and safe. We're going to start off with our first round of panelists today, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here, for taking your time, preparing your testimony. Just a small reminder to all witnesses, you have 5 minutes, and I will give you a signal, a hand signal, at 1 when we have 1 minute left, and when we have 30 seconds, I'll just raise up my hand like this, okay? And then I'll have to ask you to conclude at 5 minute mark. Today with us we have Maral Karimi, a doctoral candidate here as an individual. From the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change, we have Kasra Abari, who is a senior analyst on Iran and Shia Islamist extremism. As an individual, we have Nakang Kausar, an environmental journalist and water issues analyst. So without further ado, we're going to start off with Karisa Arabi. Please, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Members, Iran is at an inflection point. There are two contrasting realities, and I want to use this opportunity to shed light on both and how the international community, not least leading democracies like Canada, can help shape the right outcome. The victory of hardline Islamist cleric Ebrahim Raisi marks a key turning point for the clerical regime, something that's been overlooked by the West. For the Ayatollah, Raisi's presidency is about advancing Iran to what he regards as the next stages of the Islamic Revolution. The next stages of the Islamic Revolution are about forcefully achieving Ayatollah Khamenei's Islamic society and consolidating his grip over the Middle East. To advance these stages, Raisi has been mandated to purify the regime. This means empowering and the most radical and ideologically committed forces to Khamenei. The danger that accompanies the new regime in Tehran lies not only in Raisi as an individual, but the driving force behind him, namely Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Against this backdrop, the IRGC has formed the foundation of the Raisi administration, with IRGC affiliates occupying key ministerial roles and many of the 874 government appointee positions. This includes both the interior and foreign ministers. The former Ahmad Vahidi, who is on an Interpol most wanted list for his direct role in the bombing of a Jewish cultural center in Argentina in 1994, and the latter Hossein Amir Abdullahian, an IRGC Quds Force affiliate, who previously earned the title of Qasim Soleimani's representative. Domestically, the IRGC is preparing to unleash a new wave of Islamization on the Iranian people to eradicate non-Islamic influences, including Western and Persian aspects of Iranian society. Women and youth are the primary targets. As part of the plan to consolidate Khamenei's grip over the Middle East, the IRGC is working towards two major objectives: the forceful departure of the US to isolate Israel, and secondly, to target the Abraham Accords. Under this agenda, all Arab states that have or are thinking about normalizing ties with Israel are targets. Now let's turn to the other side of the story, the other reality. While Khamenei is laying the foundation to forcefully achieve his ideal Islamic society, the gap between the regime and the people could not be further. Since the early 1990s, Iranian society has witnessed a gradual process of secularization and liberalization. And today, this has reached unprecedented levels, with polling revealing that as many as 68% of Iranians want a secular state and only 32% identify as Shia Muslim, a clear rejection of the Shia Islamist regime. Dissent has manifested itself on the streets, and tracking the trend of unrest in Iran, we can see that protests are growing in size, scale, and are becoming more violent in nature. The 1999 unrest took place in 3 cities and 7 people were killed. In 2009, 10 years on, protests were in 10 cities and around 100 people were killed. Iran's latest protest in November 2019, however, saw protests in over 100 towns and cities, and as many as 1,500 civilians were killed in just a few days. All the signs indicate that this protest trend in Iran will continue on an upward trajectory. This new wave of unrest can be traced back to winter 2017 and is explicitly about outright changing the system. Crucially, this trend began when the US was part of the JCPOA and 11 months before sanctions were reimposed. This itself shows the protests are not just about Iran's economic situation, but are about the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic. And the slogans are the biggest indicator. Right now on the streets, unlike 2009, where calls for reform were still popular, today the Iranian people are chanting, mullahs must get lost, down with the Islamic Republic, and Khamenei is a murderer, his regime is illegitimate. So how can Canada help curb the IRGC's plan and advance the Iranian people's aspirations? The first key thing in terms of policy, the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization is critical. The Guard is not a conventional armed force. It started off an Islamist militia and has maintained that militia identity. Through the way it behaves, it is no different to other Islamist groups. First, indoctrination is key in the IRGC. Just as groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda spend resources radicalizing their fighters, the IRGC does the same. In fact, the same Quranic verses ISIS and Al-Qaeda use to give religious legitimacy to wage jihad against Jews, Christians, and Muslims who reject their ideology are the exact same Quranic verses that the IRGC uses in its indoctrination material. Today, more than 50% of IRGC training is indoctrination. And just look at the modus operandi of the IRGC: terrorism, hostage-taking, hijackings, and insurgency. Of course, the world cannot forget when the Guard deliberately fired 2 rockets at a civilian passenger plane, flight PS-752, killing all those on board, majority Canadian citizens. There is added urgency to designating the Revolutionary Guard. Why? Because it's becoming more extreme and radical. There is a militaristic and apocalyptic cult of Mahdiism that is on the rise in the Guard. They regard Israel's existence as the biggest barrier to the return of the hidden Imam, and this is the clearest and most direct threat to the existence of the state of Israel. What policy steps then can Canada take to advance the Iranian people's aspirations? Like Putin's regime, the Islamic Republic is corrupt to its core. While the regime enforces a hardline Islamist order on the Iranian people, their sons, their daughters, the noble-born, or Aghazadehs, as we call them in Farsi, live lavish lifestyles in the West, including in Canada. These individuals must be targeted with sanctions. Secondly, protests are already ongoing in Iran. For the past 3 weeks, we've witnessed them. The next weeks and months, we will likely see a nationwide unrest on the scale of November 2019. Agility will be key. Voicing support for the Iranian people, making sure Iranians have access to the internet, and targeting their oppressors through Magnitsky sanctions will be essential. Finally, Canada can and should lead international efforts to target the IRGC and support the Iranian people.
Thank you, Mr. Arabi, for your testimony, and we'll continue to have engage with you through questions and answers. Now I'll go to our second panelist, Ms. Karimi, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you. You're on mute right now.
Sorry.
Please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My aim today is to provide an overall view of the direction of social movements as well as the state of human rights in Iran. I will begin by mapping the waves of unrest that's been shaping up in recent years, marking a significant shift in the direction and social base of protest movements in Iran. Most major uprisings in modern Iran, including the more recent Green Movement of 2009, as well as the 79 Revolution, were rooted primarily in the political desires of the urban middle classes. Recent eruptions, however, are largely characterized by economic underpinnings in geographical regions far from urban centers. Teachers' unions, Tehran, bus drivers' union, and other trade unions of various stripes Oil laborers, students, pensioners, and shopkeepers are simply some of the groups that have displayed their collective dissatisfaction on streets in recent years. Wages and safe working conditions are amongst key demands. Government's response is often intense crackdown, including detention, solitary confinement, forced confessions, and torture. During an intense period of unrest in November 2019, many Iranians protested a threefold rise in the cost of petroleum in well over 100 cities. Security forces shut down the internet, close to 1,500 protesters were killed, and many more were jailed. In January 2020, the Iranian public still mourning the November protests, they were confronted with the aftermath of General Soleimani's assassination by the United States and the downing of a Ukrainian passenger plane by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards, killing all 176 on board, many Canadians. The Islamic Republic's utter disregard for human life and its propensity for violence has tragically had far-reaching implications here at home in Canada with the downing of flight PS 752. The new wave of opposition to the regime, however, is characteristically different than prior periods, for it is threatening the ideological base of an ideological system, a measure that can prove fatal for the regime. Since onset, the IRI has branded itself as the Republic of the Dispossessed and managed to legitimize its violent consolidation of power based on that narrative. Loss of legitimacy in the eyes of its base of support is therefore no small feat. Ideological regimes are deeply dependent on their base in justifying repression. The current economic crisis further exasperates that crisis of legitimacy. IRI's inability to deliver its promise to materially better their collective lot further disillusions its political base. In the last year alone, over 4,000 labor and trade protests have taken place. Last week, over 120 teachers were detained. Some have been released since, but as many as 36 remain in detention. At least 10 jailed teachers and countless other activists are on hunger strike. Teachers' Union is of particular significance since they have national organizational and mobilization capacity. Furthermore, women, including the currently detained Rehana Ansari, make up considerable numbers, both in leadership and membership of the union. Union spokesperson Mohammad Habibi, as well as Jafar Ibrahimi and Rasoul Bodaghi, are amongst teachers in solitary confinement in the notorious Evin prison. The list, as you can imagine, is long. State repression, however, does not end there, and regime frequently resorts to hostage diplomacy by detaining dual and foreign nationals on fabricated charges to justify suppression domestically and to demand concessions in international negotiations. Case in point, recently 2 French teachers visiting their counterparts in Iran were arrested on allegations of espionage. Dissent also continues to intensify amongst regime's longtime opponents, including women, ethnics, and intellectuals. Examples of such expressions of solidarity are Narges Mohammadi and Nasrin Sotoudeh, both lawyers and human rights activists. They're amongst many rights and civil society activists that have persistently stood by the protesters. Women, the first casualty of regime's gender apartheid, have also expressed strong solidarity. The situation in Iran is dire, and the evidence suggests that systemic repression and state violence, as well as the country's political and economic stability, will only get worse for the foreseeable future. Canada's commitment to democracy within its borders and beyond makes it moral and political imperative to support these organic democratic movements.
Thank you, Ms. Karami.
Thank you.
We are just have reached our time for you, but we'll be able to continue to engage with you in questions and answers. Thank you for that. Now, if we can go on to our third and final witness, Mr. Kausar, please, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. You're on mute still.
Sorry. Thank you, sir. I will read part of my statement about Iran's state of water, environment, human rights, and related issues. In 2001, as a water conservationist and journalist, I warned former President Khatami in person about the effects of the flawed policies of his Ministry of Energy, briefing him on the impact of his administration's plans to build more dams and transfer water from one basin to another to serve the special interests while ignoring the importance of watershed management and maintaining aquifers. Water scarcity in many rural areas has forced millions of farmers and peasants to leave their ancestral lands and homes for the margins of major cities. The lack of proper infrastructure has disappointed these migrants, and the government has no plans to assist the victims of its water and food policies. Based on Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's demands, the government is encouraging farmers to produce more grains in a time of extreme water shortage that in turn has turned Iran into a water bankrupt nation. Based on the result of the recent research, Iran has lost twice the amount of its annual renewable water resources between 2003 and 2018. And while the government is encouraging population growth, water resources are disappearing, aquifer by aquifer, lake by lake, and river by river, resulting in a negative impact on Iran's wildlife as well. As you all may know, Iranian-Canadian wildlife conservationist Dr. Qaboos Saeed-Emami was a victim of the regime's brutality. Many in the Islamic Republic have no respect for wildlife and biodiversity, and they cannot tolerate activities led by the likes of Dr. Saeed-Emami. In the last few years, Iran has witnessed unrest related to water scarcity, and lives have been lost. Major cities in Iran are literally sinking as a result of land subsidence caused by groundwater depletion. Iran's leaders have continuously demanded the farmers produce grains so they could prove to the world that the regime is self-sufficient and does not need to obey the international norms. And instead of importing products with high water consumption, Iran is using more than half of its groundwater resources to produce wheat and other grains. While we understand the continuation of water shortage would eventually turn into unrest and revolt, I'm concerned about the unpreparedness of the opposition forces to manage the water and environmental resources after the fall of the Islamic regime. And I believe that Canada can have a great role in assisting Iran in the future. There are many knowledgeable Iranian-Canadian water experts who can build a sustainable bridge between the two nations. But there are also a number of Iranian Canadians who have assisted the regime in destroying the environment. Canada should take a stand. Most of the projects that led to this disaster were constructed by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Khatam al-Anbiya construction headquarters and the Mohabe Quds consulting firm. Mohabe Quds is currently on the United States sanctions list. It should be noted that many employees of Mohabe Quds are now citizens of Canada, and the head of Mohabe Quds has traveled freely to Canada to visit his loved ones. It has been stated that a number of people associated with the Revolutionary Guards have lived and invested in Canada. As per an Iranian regime news agency, Alireza Raz Hosseini, an associate of General Qasem Soleimani, has previously lived in Canada. Mr. Raz Hosseini, a former IRGC commander during the Iran-Iraq War and a former cabinet minister under Rouhani's administration, was once referred by General Soleimani as our man in Canada. Interestingly, before entering Rouhani's administration, Mr. Raz Hosseini became the governor of 2 provinces, and he had a very bad environmental record in Kerman and Khorasan Razavi. In short, I can say that given the state of the environment and water resources, the Islamic regime cannot be sustainable. After 43 years of the rule of Ayatollahs and 42 years of hostage taking, the rulers of civilized and democratic countries must be smart enough to know that not resisting the hostage takers and terrorists will result in nothing but defeat. Ignoring the views of Iranian intellectuals who have not complied with the wishes of the Ayatollah cannot be in the interest of the democratic world, especially Canada. A regime that does not recognize women and imprison scientists and protectors of the environment does not deserve any sort of compromise. We have a saying in our region: we will not give into force unless it is very forceful. Governments and representatives should also learn from strong individuals that did not give in to the very strong IRGC. Today, at the next meeting, Hamid Esmailion is going to present his case. I strongly believe that Mr. Esmailion and other individuals who lost their loved ones have shown us how strength and perseverance against the powerful element that shot down PS 752 could break the camel's back, which is the Islamic regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelsar. We'll now be going to questions and answers, starting with the Liberal Party, with Mr. Assassi. Please, for 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you also to the three people who've presented today. Very, very grateful for your insights. Now, what we have heard is very, very disturbing. All three of you have actually highlighted the role of the Islamic Revolutionary IRGC. We know that they're responsible for terrible things within the region, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Iraq. We know that they are the group that actually cracks down on civil society every time there are protests in Iran. And we also know, thanks to our last speaker, that they are essentially looting the country by building dams, creating all sorts of different problems. So allow me to start off with Mr. Arabi. What are the lessons to be learned for Canada and indeed the international community as the IRGC consolidates its hold over Iran?
Thank you, Mr. Assassi. In terms of the lessons to be learned, the first key thing is that the Islamic Republic is becoming more ideological. There is no doubt that it's becoming more ideological. Khamenei is empowering the IRGC because he regards the IRGC as the Sutun Khayme Enqalab, which means the main pillar of the Islamic Revolution. Contrary to some assessments, this is not going to lead to the Revolutionary Guard undertaking a military coup against the regime. The clergy itself, the hardline clergy, is empowering the IRGC. And what we see today is an IRGC government, an IRGC deep state, and really that is tied, essentially their DNA is tied to the hardline clergy. So moving forward, without taking action against the IRGC, so if we look at the way Ayatollah Khamenei pursues foreign policy, Khamenei pursues a dual foreign policy through diplomacy and militancy. Previously, the diplomatic wing was controlled by the Iranian government, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the technocrats. And the militancy aspect was controlled by the IRGC. Today, we see that the IRGC has occupied the government, so the diplomatic wing as well. And so far, the West has only really attempted to engage with that diplomatic arm, leaving the IRGC's actions unchecked. And that's essentially why we saw during the 2015 nuclear agreement, the IRGC effectively used the 2015 nuclear agreement as a bargaining chip over the West. In doing so, it was able to escalate in the Middle East. So its footprint during the JCPOA years expanded across the Middle East. We saw that the number of IRGC manufactured militias, these are militias that are made by the Revolutionary Guard, increased as sanctions were eased. And domestically, we saw that the IRGC was able to enrich its pockets even more. And each time the Guard stepped out, the Islamic Republic stepped out of line, including, by the way, terrorist operations on European soil, assassinations on European soil, the West would essentially bite its tongue for fear that Iran would walk away, the Islamic Republic would walk away from the nuclear deal. Today, where we are today is that the IRGC de facto controls the Iranian government and has control of the deep state. Without taking action and countering it, this problem is only going to escalate. And if we look at sanctions relief today, there's no doubt that rather than seek to alleviate the pressure on the Iranian people, Ayatollah Khamenei and the IRGC are digging in their heels and they're bolstering their security forces. If sanctions are eased on the Islamic Republic, much like Putin's regime, that won't end up in the pockets of ordinary Iranians. Rather, it will serve to bolster the very forces that suppress the Iranian people on the streets.
Thank you ever so much. Now, if I could go to Ms. Karimi. Ms. Karimi, over the course of the past several years, we have watched as organic protests have occurred throughout Iran in numerous cities, I think more than 100 cities, At the forefront of this is teachers' unions, pensioners, workers from the transportation sector. However, given the terrible state of the Iranian economy, what are prospects as we move forward?
And Ms. Karimi, within 2 minutes, please, at most. Thank you.
Thank you. I try to point out in my remarks that the regime is suffering from serious economic crises. So essentially, there is lack of political will as well as economic will. There is the coffers of the regime are essentially empty, or at least they're empty when it comes to infrastructure and spending on the masses. And so in the absence of the regime being able to meet the economic demands of its people, these protests are going to continue to happen, as we have seen since 2017, early 2018. These waves of protests are continue to occur, and the most of them have economic underpinnings. But the what I'm also trying to point out is that these links of protests are becoming more and more connected. We see expressions of solidarity amongst various groups, not only the working class, but also the middle class, women, ethnics, etc. So these protests are going to continue to happen. They're organic, they're organized nationwide, especially by the teachers union. But what we expect the the democratic world, particularly Canada, to do is to stand by those democratic movements.
And lastly, you had said that Canada, it behooves us to support civil society in Iran. How do you think we can do so?
Well, Iran, as well as Canada, are signatories to multiple workers and unions and syndicates, in, including the ILO, the International Labor Organizations, across the world, or the Education International. And Iran currently is not meeting its obligations to facilitate. It's actually criminalizing the various activists from within the country to meet their counterparts outside in the international community. As I mentioned, there are two French nationals, a husband and wife.
We've gone over time, but you'll be able to elaborate potentially in other questions and answers. Now moving on to Conservative Party for 7 minutes. Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony. I will direct my first question to Mr. Arabi. I concur with you fully in your recommendation that the Government of Canada list the IRGC as a terrorist entity. 4 years ago, the House of Commons voted overwhelmingly to do so, including the Prime Minister. Yet 4 years later, no steps have been taken in that regard, not even after, as you note, the IRGC is responsible for the blood of 55 Canadians and 30 permanent residents in the takedown of PS 752. Now, why the government hasn't acted is, I don't know. Often the response from the government is to simply say, well, we've designated the Quds Force, the IRGC, as a terrorist organization. So perhaps if you could just elaborate on why that is completely inadequate. To simply say, well, the Quds Force is designated and therefore, we're addressing this.
Thank you. In terms of the Quds Force is a branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, like other branches of the Guard. It makes no sense to just target the Quds Force. The Revolutionary Guard itself, if you look at its DNA, it first of all started off as an Islamist militia, as I explained, and it's maintained that militia identity throughout the way it behaves. The IRGC as a whole uses terrorism, militancy, hostage takings, hijackings, not just the Quds Force. The entire Revolutionary Guard undergoes ideological indoctrination. Radicalization accounts for more than 50% of the Revolutionary Guard's training, and that's for all Revolutionary Guard members, not just the Quds Force. The content in that indoctrination material, and I've assessed this and published a report on it, it is explicitly clear that it is violent and extremist in nature and no different to the content that prescribed groups use to indoctrinate their fighters, from the likes of ISIS and Al-Qaeda to Hezbollah. And on Hezbollah, Hezbollah is designated in Canada. The IRGC created Hezbollah. The IRGC wrote its charter. Hossein Dehghan, IRGC commander, in the 1980s, wrote the Hezbollah charter. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps today is Hezbollah's biggest supporter, financially, militarily, in terms of training and logistics. If Hezbollah warrants being on the list, then there is no reason why the IRGC, its main arm, its founder, should not be on the list too. You cannot draw a distinction between the Quds Force and the Revolutionary Guard. The Quds Force is a mere branch of the Revolutionary Guard as an entity.
Thank you for that. In addition to listing the IRGC as a terrorist organization, we do have, the government has at its disposal, Magnitsky sanctions. 2 years ago, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights recommended that on the list of those who should be targeted includes President Raisi, as well as the head of the judiciary. President Raisi, of course, played an integral role in the 1988 massacre of more than 30,000 civilians. What are your thoughts on that, and whatever measures can the Government of Canada take to hold those who are responsible for gross human rights violations accountable?
Absolutely. Magnitsky sanctions are a key lever for Canada to take, and all liberal democracies to take, against human rights violators in the Islamic Republic. And it's really important because, again, as I mentioned, much like the former Soviet Union, much like Putin's regime, the Islamic Republic is a regime that is corrupt to its core. And Magnitsky sanctions can really act as a deterrent for future human rights violators. Why? Because the same individuals, the same elites that enforce these hardline Islamist policies on the Iranian people, that commit human rights violations, their sons, their daughters, their families travel to the West. They live abroad. They live lavish lifestyles across the West, including in Canada. Using Magnitsky sanctions, which imposes travel bans, which freezes assets, can really act as a deterrent. And for future protests, and there will be future protests, by the way, there will be future protests. But that using those sanctions could make that individual think twice before they order a massacre on the Iranian streets. So I think Magnitsky sanctions are an essential tool for Canada to use in targeting Islamic Republic officials.
You think President Raisi should be included on that list?
It is absolutely clear that President Raisi was involved, and he says he's proud to have been involved in the Hayat Mag, the death committee, which was responsible for the deaths of as many as 30,000 Iranians. He has been designated by the United States, and I think that other Western nations should follow suit.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
If we can, thank you for that, Mr. Cooper. And now we're going to continue on with our next questioner, Monsieur Trudel. Vous avez 7 minutes.
Mr. Trudel, you have 7 minutes. Thank you. Thank you to all our witnesses. Thank you for being here today. It was very interesting to hear your presentations. I'll begin with Ms. Karimi. In previous studies, we've seen how dictatorial regimes use social networks. to do such things as spy on dissidents, the perceived enemies of the government. Can you say how some social networks like Facebook and Twitter are prohibited in Iran? Can you explain how the Iranian government uses social networks, social media, to basically muzzle the opposition?
The translation. If you could quickly tell me again
Okay.
what that question was.
Oui.
Yes, of course. I was talking about social media. We've seen how dictatorial regimes frequently use social media to spy on and monitor on what they see as their opponents in the country. For example, Facebook, Twitter are prohibited in Iran. But can you tell us how the government uses social media to both spy on and muzzle potential opposition to the regimes?
Definitely. Well, the Iranian regime is learning from the best and the brightest in the world of espionage and, cyber armies, aka Russia. They have trained a large cyber army that can pose as just about any kind of, they come across as different political stripes, and they spy on people. And also, more importantly, users on social media are responsible not only for their own tweets and posts and the content that they create on these platforms, they're also oftentimes responsible for the comments or discussions that other users make about their comments. They often get prosecuted for it. There are many bloggers historically and social media users that are in the government jails, and also they force activists and other people that they arrest to hand over their social media accounts. They take over those accounts and create misinformation and disinformation about those.
OK. Dites-moi un peu dans le même ordre.
In the same vein, recently in the news, we saw countries like Algeria spying on activists promoting democracy, not just in Algeria, but around the rest of the world. They use pressure, for example, using pressure on someone here with dual nationality who's supporting democracy in the country, who was forced to leave the country. All kinds of things have happened. Does Iran use measures like these to discourage the Iranian diaspora around the world from representing or characterizing Iran as a repressive state? So are they using social media for that? Is this something the Iranian government does to fight opponents of the regime around the world?
Definitely. As an Iranian, it's regardless of whether or not you live in the country or beyond, there's always censorship of the regime. Iranians oftentimes have to be careful about even those with dual nationality, those who live beyond the borders of the Islamic Republic have always have to be vigilant of the regime censorship, because if it's not them targeted, it could be their families. And we have several instances of Facebook, of workers and specialists in Facebook, Instagram, etc., that have been pressured by the regime to cooperate against the democratic movement. And just recently, there was a small cell that was discovered in Germany that was essentially moderating the content on Instagram during the protests, the recent protests that occurred in Iran, and kind of eliminating most content that was that included, for example, death to the Ayatollahs, death to Khamenei, and also most content that was contrary to the regime lines.
Merci.
And these are people hired by Instagram.
Monsieur Tourelle, vous avez
You have 1 minute and 25 seconds left, Mr. Trudel. Thank you. My next question is for Mr. Arabi. Could you please tell us something about the ties between the Iranian regime and Hezbollah in Lebanon? Is there a link?
There is a 100% link. Hezbollah was created by the Revolutionary Guard. As I said, Hossein Dehghan, who was the former defense minister of former president, so-called reformist President Hassan Rouhani, his defense minister in the early 1980s, wrote the Hezbollah Charter. The Islamic Republic, via the IRGC, has been the biggest supporter for Hezbollah ideologically, in terms of training, militarily, in terms of supply of arms, and in terms of logistics and coordination. Hezbollah is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' proxy. It is Iran's proxy group. The group vows allegiance, complete and absolute allegiance, to Ayatollah Khamenei as their supreme leader, as well as leader of the Islamic world. The point to which... Oh, sorry.
If you conclude your thought.
I just wanted to end on this final point, that the wages of all Hezbollah operatives are paid by the Islamic Republic. And sources in Lebanon tell me that for ordinary Hezbollah fighters, they are now being paid in local currency by Tehran, as Iran's regime no longer has the funds. From what I have heard, from credible sources, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has told them to hold out, wait until sanctions are eased, and they will return to dollar payments. That is essentially Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah chief, has said explicitly, everything we have comes from the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you for that. And merci, Monsieur Trudel.
Thank you, Mr. Trudel. We'll continue.
Person, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I also would like to echo my colleagues in thanking the witnesses for being here today. This is obviously very, very difficult testimony to hear. However, I don't think it's terribly surprising for many of us in this room. You know, we have seen a Iranian regime which has time and time again put the lives of Iranians at risk, has murdered Iranian citizens, has tortured, has committed horrific crimes. So as horrible as this testimony is to hear, I don't think that there are many in this room that are surprised. What I think we need to get to the bottom of as the Human Rights Subcommittee is the role Canada can play, how Canada can alleviate what is happening in Iran, and what we can do to support the Iranian people. That has to be our first priority. And I would like to start by getting a little bit more information about the impacts of this regime on the human rights of women, minority groups, and youth in particular, and the way that Canada can support them, both in Iran and outside of Iran in Canada. So perhaps I'll start with Mrs. Kalami, if I could, and then I'll ask Mr. Arabi. I don't think we have our third witness with us any longer, is that? Unfortunately. So, Ms. Kalami, if I could start with you, please.
Definitely. As I mentioned, Iranian women were the first casualty and probably the greatest losers of the Islamic Republic. There is essentially a gender apartheid the system in place in Iran. Women's clothing is regulated, their movements are regulated, and sexism and essentially misogyny are the rules of the land. However, how Canada can help these groups is what I would like to ask you here to is to frame Iran not simply from the perspective of its relationship with the United States, either as an evil terrorist or as a victim of imperialism. Iran is as any other country, it's 50 shades of gray. And so there are organic movements, democratic seeking movements that are shaping up in the country, and as well as the IRGC and the Quds forces. And so there is that conflict and contrast, and we need the democratic world, we need Canada to first and foremost recognize that and kind of not and understand those different shades. Another issue, which I think my colleagues and other witnesses here pointed out, is that there are many descendants of the IRGC and the offspring of the elite, the ruling elite in Iran, who live here, who essentially use the resources brought over from that country here, resources that can be used in the country for that people. And we need Canada to take a better look, a more serious look at that and kind of acknowledge that. And we also need support in terms of media. We all know as soon as an activist or a cause gets to media and gets that kind of attention, both on social media and traditional media, the regime oftentimes has to back out. So if I were to summarize, I would say that just that at this point we really need Canada to understand that Iran is 50 shades of gray. There are democratic movements going on, to acknowledge that some of the resources of the country are being illegally brought to Canada, and we need help with recognition of these movements in the media and elsewhere.
Thank you for that, and certainly that recognition, I have that recognition. So we will continue to work from within this room to make sure that recognition is there. Mr. Arabi, if I could turn to you next, please.
Sure. As I mentioned, Khamenei believes that he has not yet achieved his ideal Islamic society. He is moving towards that. That is why Raisi's been de facto appointed, and that is why the Revolutionary Guard, the hardline enforcers of the regime, are forming the foundation of that administration. First and foremost, the targets will be women. The clerical regime is not satisfied with the current role of Iranian women in society. Iranian women have resisted the regime's ideal of a woman being the regime's ideal of women being mothers and wives. And there are early warning signs as to what the regime is going to do to counter this effectively and, quote, in their eyes, restore women's role to be mothers and wives. The first is, in practical terms, restricting women's work hours and reducing university quotas for women. We've already seen that Raisi, for example, late last year, on November the 4th, said that working hours should not be planned in such a way as to neglect the role of women as mothers and wives. He declared that it is necessary for all companies and departments to set up work plans for women in a way that it does not inflict disruption on family life. Similarly, the university quotas are likely to be reduced for women, and there is precedent for this. This happened during the presidency of hardline President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. And just to give you a flavor of the way in which the Islamic Republic views women, the Interior Minister, IRGC Commander Ahmad Vahidi, who is current Interior Minister, he said, if the Islamic Republic is going to be harmed it will be by women. There are many steps Canada can take to support Iranian women who really are at the front line of resisting the regime. We really have a vibrant underground feminist movement in Iran. And they need the West supports, and they are looking for recognitions. The first is, as I've mentioned, Magnitsky sanctions, targeting the institutions and the individuals who are responsible for specifically repressing and targeting women. That's the first step that the Canadian government can play. But also,
if you can just very concluding brief remarks for 10 seconds, please, Mr. Arabi.
Sure. Finally, as our other panelists have said, global recognition is absolutely key. Canada has, according to the Canadian government, is pursuing a feminist foreign policy. As part of that, it must recognize this vibrant feminist movement, underground movement in Iran, and it must support it in every possible way. A big part of that is international recognition.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Arabi, and that unfortunately concludes our time. But this has been a very enriching testimony that you have shared with all of us. I want to personally thank the witnesses, but also on behalf of all the committee members here and all the staff who are supporting all the members here, to thank you today for taking the time. We will be including what you're saying into our reports. So unfortunately, Mr. Kausar had to leave a little bit early to catch a flight. But we want to thank you all three, Ms. Karami and Mr. Arabi, for being here. Thank you. We'll suspend for a few minutes, approximately, is it 5? 2 minutes. We're going to suspend for 2 minutes. Thank you to all the witnesses. You can log off. We're going to bring in our other witnesses. Take care.
Thank you very much.
And we're going to continue on with our second panel. Thank you to all the witnesses for being here. In particular, Kylie, Mary, Moore, Gilbert, we know that you're tuning in, or joining us from Australia, I should say, where it's in the wee hours of the morning. For being in person, Mr. Hamid Esmalian, good to see you in person. And also, we have Miriam Shafipour as an individual joining us today remotely. And finally, we have Mr. Sajadpour joining us also remotely. Thank you for being here. Mr. Sajadpour is a Senior Fellow Middle East Program with Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And Mr. Asmelian is from the Association of Families of Flight PS 752 Victims. Without further ado, we're gonna start with Miss Moore Gilbert, please, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for having me, and for your warm welcome this morning, very early in the morning here in Australia. And I guess I was saying particularly about the IRGC, I guess I'm a victim of the IRGC myself through my own experiences, but I also witnessed their gross violations of human rights toward Iranian prisoners, toward their own prisoners. And I guess I can speak a little bit about my own experience, but also more broadly about their attitudes and their behaviors toward political prisoners, and, you know, more generally within the system itself, building on what the previous speaker, Arabi, said regarding the fact that there's been this process of state capture, and that often the Revolutionary Guards really seem to be running the show in areas where the judiciary or the elected wing, so-called elected wing of the government used to dominate. So I was essentially a diplomatic hostage of the Revolutionary Guards for 2 years and 3 months. I was arrested in September 2018 at Tehran airport. I had travelled to Iran. I'm an Australian British national. I have no link to Iran whatsoever. And I'd travelled to Iran for a brief 3-week period to attend an academic conference in my capacity as lecturer in Islamic studies at the University of Melbourne in Australia. And I was arrested at the airport whilst attempting to depart the country by the Revolutionary Guards, who accused me eventually of being a spy. I was convicted 1 year later in a sham trial in a revolutionary court, which obviously is the parallel court system of the Revolutionary Guards within the judiciary. And I was given a 10-year sentence. There was absolutely no evidence whatsoever, not even presented in the closed-door secretive court. I essentially, from the early days of my arrest, was viewed as a bargaining chip by the Revolutionary Guards, essentially a hostage, somebody that they could exchange for some sort of concession or benefit from one of my countries, because they knew that I was both British and Australian. The Australian government took the lead in negotiating my release, and again, building on what the previous speaker said about the Revolutionary Guards kind of taking over the state or acting as a deep state, the Australian government had to negotiate with the IRGC directly in order to secure my release, not with the Iranian Foreign Ministry, not with the official or recognised wing of the Iranian government. Obviously, they tried talking to those guys at the very beginning, but diplomatically, it became clear that they had no power over my case, and that they had to go directly to the source, to the hostage takers themselves, and find out what they wanted. And what they wanted was the release of 3 of their citizens, 3 IRGC members and IRGC operatives. So they wanted their own guys, not just any old Iranian citizen, from a Thai prison who'd been convicted of attempting to blow up the Israeli ambassador's car in Bangkok about a decade prior. So, you know, when I was in prison, I personally was subjected to numerous human rights violations. particularly psychological torture methods, prolonged periods of time in extreme solitary confinement. I spent 12 months cumulatively in solitary. All sorts of human rights of mine were abused, but that was actually the norm, and I saw treatment much worse meted out to Iranian nationals. Some of the co-defendants of the Canadian citizen Kavus Said Emami were my cellmates, and I learned a lot about his fate. Obviously, he passed away in Evin prison in 2018, Canadian professor, and the circumstances surrounding his death, have never been really explained by the Iranian regime. He died in IRGC custody under interrogation. We were told by IRGC members in the facility Dualef, where we were kept at the time, that he actually had a heart attack under interrogation, and this was covered up and made to look like a suicide.
Ms. Moore-Gilbert, you have about 30
I
seconds left.
was also in. Okay, sure. Sorry, this is a bit scattergun. I'm, if you have obviously more specific questions speaking to any, specific subject, I'd be more than happy to answer them. I guess I just want to say that I guess I'm through my own lived experience, I can bear witness or testimony to multiple types of human rights abuses perpetrated by the Iranian state and the IRGC to not only innocent Iranians, but also foreigners who get caught up in a hostage-taking business model. So yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions on that subject.
Thank you, Ms. Moore-Gilbert, for that testimony and for sharing your ordeal with us. We'll now turn to Mr. Hamid Asmalian from the Association of Families of Flight 7 PS 752. Victims, and just for everybody's witnesses who are here, I'll put up this symbol for 1 minute and this for 30 seconds, okay? Please, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the honorable members of the committee for giving me your time this afternoon. 30 months have passed since the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps IRGC of Iran committed a heinous crime over the skies of Tehran by shooting down Ukraine International Flight PS 752. Canada's tepid and cautious approach to pursuing justice against the government of Iran has left many of the families of the victims and many Canadians in a state of despair. 2.5 years after this crime was committed, the most fundamental facts surrounding this crime remain shrouded in mystery. Knowledgeable observers have every reason to believe that the shooting of the missiles at the plane was intentional. In a sense, the Iranian government used the 177 passengers and crew as human shields. We can all agree that over the course of the past 2.5 years, the Iranian regime has refused to provide essential facts to investigators. Instead, it has systematically lied and misled to successfully impede the emergence of the factual matrix that led to this crime. Apart from deliberately obfuscating, the Iranian government and the IRGC have subjected relatives of the victims to crushing psychological pressure. As publicly noted by the Prime Minister's Special Advisor, the Honorable Ralph Goodell, the report provided by the Islamic Republic was shambolic and riddled with lies. Similarly, Ms. Calamar, a former UN Special Rapporteur, has publicly stated that the narrative offered by the Islamic Republic is merely designed to confuse and bewilder. Allow me to apprise you of the travesty of justice the families of the victims who are in Iran have faced in that country. The Iranian regime has subjected families in Iran to extreme psychological pressure and physical abuse. A report published by Human Rights Watch in May 2021 references physical torture, and I can assure you that the practice has been widespread. Family members in Iran have been subjected to repeated interrogations. Some family members were barred from the courtroom, while the entire proceedings were conducted under strict security conditions designed to intimidate. Finally, the show trials, orchestrated by the military courts of Tehran, were abandoned after challenges were raised by the families in Iran. Among other such examples, the so-called Islamic Human Rights Commission of Iran has repeatedly harassed families with phone calls and personal visits in an attempt to force them to accept financial compensation or to compel them to sign waivers. According to these waivers, families are expected to waive all their rights and to forego any legal options that may allow them to pursue legal remedies. Fortunately, a majority of the families have rejected such offers. I should also emphasize that the families of the Afghan passengers who reside in Iran have also been subjected to unimaginable pressures. More recently, in March, when some family members attended a rally against Russia's invasion of Ukraine in Tehran, one of the victims' fathers was brutally beaten, while a mother was dragged on the ground by her hair as she was taken to the local police station. Another one of the victims' fathers was slapped in the face. Intimidation extends to relatives of the victims here in Canada as well. Yet, after 30 months, the Iranian government's thuggish behavior and chicanery remains unchecked. None of the 5 governments that lost their citizens in the tragedy have referred the PS752 file to the International Criminal Court. The RCMP refuses to open a domestic criminal investigation. Moreover, there is no confirmation as to when the file be referred to the ICAO Council or the International Court of Justice. Similarly, the families demand to include the IRGC on the list of terrorist organizations in Canada or to impose Magnitsky sanctions have fallen on deaf ears. It is downright absurd and offensive that the United States has listed many more IRGC commanders on its sanctions list than Canada has. Instead, we were recently shocked to hear that the Islamic Republic soccer team had been invited to Canada under the guise of a friendly match. This ill-advised plan was fortunately cancelled thanks to the overwhelming support of Canadians. The Canadian government's failure to take concrete steps in a timely fashion has emboldened the criminal government of Iran and the IRGC. Insofar as the Iranian government is concerned, it has succeeded in not being held to account for this horrific crime. In the face of all the grief, disappointment, and despair, the Association of the Families of Flight PS752 victims remain steadfast in their commitment to unveil the truth and bring the real perpetrators of this heinous crime to justice. Let the PS752 and recent Russian atrocities in Ukraine serve as a sober reminder that appeasement with tyrants will only result in more suffering. True justice is not negotiable. We will never forget, nor shall we ever forgive. Thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you for that testimony. And within 5 minutes, Mr. Assamilian, we're going to exchange with you further, but thank you for that. Next, I'll turn to Mr. Sajadpour for 5 minutes, and please, without further ado.
Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be with you. In particular, I want to say how honored I am to be sharing this platform with Mr. Hamid Ismailioun. I consider him to be a role model for the Iranian diaspora community. I consider him to be a moral compass for the Iranian diaspora community in all of North America. And I really hope that the families of the PS752 victims get the justice they deserve. I also want to recommend to all of you Kylie Moore Gilbert's remarkable book, The Uncaged Sky, which I've read a dozen of these prison memoirs, and hers was really the most vivid example of the atrocities that are suffered on a daily basis in Iranian prisons. And I also am honored to share the stage with her. I will be brief in saying that we now have a 43-year case study of the Iranian regime. And although Iran is inaccessible to independent analysis and journalism, perhaps no government in the world has had a more consistent and enduring ideology over the last 4 decades. And essentially, there have been 3 components to Iran's grand strategy. Number one, Iran has sought to defeat what they would call the US-led world order, defeat a liberal democratic world order, and try to replace it with an illiberal, undemocratic world order. Number two, Iran has sought to replace Israel with Palestine. And number 3, Iran has sought to remake the Middle East in its image. Now, what Iran has done quite effectively, more effectively than any other country in the Middle East, has been to fill regional power vacuums. I think it's now well established that Iran has outsized influence in 4 countries in the Arab world: Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and Iraq. They've managed to do so by using regional proxies to fill those power vacuums. And I think, as the previous panel attested to, the government of Iran has one of the world's worst human rights records, and they've essentially exported that human rights record to their regional proxies. And I would say that there's 5-6 things that Iran's regional proxies have in common. Here we're talking about Lebanese Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, Hashd al-Shab, the Shia militias in Iraq, as well as many more ancillary groups. So one of the things all these Iran and its militias have in common is an intolerance toward women. Second thing is an intolerance towards religious minorities and an anti-Semitism, which all the proxies share. Third is a persecution of LGBT communities. Fourth is hostility, repression of independent thinkers. We've had several assassinations over the years in Lebanon and in Iraq. Fifth is accumulation of wealth through illicit means. And as a previous panelist pointed out, increasingly a lot of that illicit wealth is showing up in Canada. And it's something I think you need to be mindful of. The same way that illicit Russian wealth showed up in Europe, we saw the consequences for that. Increasingly, a lot of illicit Iranian wealth is showing up in Canada. And finally, which is also very troublesome, is Iran's use of child soldiers, the Iranian proxies' use of child soldiers, in particular in Yemen with the Houthis. The final thing I'll close on is I just want to emphasize something which I know that Kylie can go into much further detail on. And it is the case of a former Canadian resident, Nilufar Bayani, whom Kylie has written about very eloquently in her book. She's a graduate of McGill University. She's now been a hostage in Iran for 4 years. And I think, oftentimes we can speak about human rights and the macro, and we can forget about the individual stories. But I was very moved by her story in Kylie's book, and I think she has really been forgotten about. And as a former Canadian resident, the graduate of McGill, I think in addition to the victims of the families of the victims of the Ukraine airliner's flight, I hope that her fate becomes a priority for the Canadian Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sajadpour. And we'll continue on to our final witness and then questions and answers. Ms. Safipour, please, for 5 minutes.
It is the case of
Hello?
a former Canadian resident, Nilufar Bayani.
Hello?
Hear you well, Ms. Safipour.
Oh, sorry, because I hear Mr. Sajadpour voice. Thanks for having me. This is my second attendance as a witness at SDIR. My family in Iran has been under attack and pressure since my first testimony in 2018, and I reported this to CSIS a few months ago, and I reattend today because I mentioned this because I wanted to say how this important.
Ms. Safipour, if you can just pause for a moment, we'll correct the audio. There is some background noise.
Oh, sure. Hello?
Do you have anything running in the back?
Hello?
Any audio in your space where you are, Ms. Safipour?
Oh, sorry, because I hear Mr. Sajadpour voice.
Do you have ParlView turned on?
This is my second attendance.
Does somebody have ParlView turned on, watching the meeting in the background?
My family in Iran has been under attack and pressure since my first testimony in 2018, and I reported this to CSIS a few months ago, and I reattend today.
We're going to suspend for a few moments.
I mentioned this because I wanted to say how this.
So you have about 4.5 minutes, Ms. Safipour. Please go ahead.
Okay, sure. This is my second attendance as a witness at SDIR. My family in Iran has been under attacks and pressure since my first testimony in 2018. And I reported this to CSIS a few months ago, and I just reattend this today. I mentioned this because I wanted to say how this is important for me and how much I appreciate this opportunity. Unfortunately, Canada has become a safe zone for Iranian authorities in recent years. And this is so disappointing for me as a human rights activist. It's not only about human rights violation in Iran, it's about Canada's domestic security. And the government of Canada should just take it so serious. And we will continue our efforts to make sure Canadians are safe and respected. Today, I will do testimony on behalf of my friend Narges Mohammadi. She's a very well-known human rights advocate in Iran, and she's currently being held in Qarchak prison in Iran. She wished to do it on her own, but unfortunately, she's arrested for the 14th time in April 12 to serve a sentence of 30 months and 74 flogging. Today, I just read two parts of her writing. One of them was published in Globe and Mail, and one part is from her private letter to Canadian MPs. She wrote that any innovation or reform in Iran must be driven by Iranian people, although democratic governments like Canada, human rights group, and the international community may play a crucial role. Holding human rights violators in Iran accountable, whether by using legal tools available like Magnitsky sanctions or through diplomatic pressure, legislation, or drawing international attention to this issue and embarrassing Islamic Republic authorities, will undoubtedly pave the way for our fight for justice and freedom, warming our hearts and bolstering our steps. Also, she wrote a private letter for Canadian MPs, and I will read the part of that. She wrote that it will happen until Canada officially bar Iranian officials from entering the country. Just a few months ago, the RGC commander and former Tehran police chief was spotted in Canada. And definitely many other Iranian government and military officials travel to Canada freely and may have residency status in Canada. And they were just so smart or lucky that they have not been yet captured by citizens' camera. And this is not called security for Canadians. As long as the ban does not become legal, not only Iranian Canadians, but all Canadians will not feel safe. Certainly no Canadian wants his family to be neighbor to a terrorist or a murderer. They can travel to Canada legally today and invest their bloody money there. We don't call on Canadian government to liberate Iran or to do anything specifically for the Iranian people outside of Canada's borders. We urge Canada to protect the security and well-being of its own citizens. Canadians deserve better than this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Safipour. And now we will continue to the first and only round of questions and answers. Given that we have to end at 6 o'clock sharp, we'll have 4 minutes per questioner, per party. Starting again with Mr. Assasi from the Liberal Party, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the extraordinary panelists who are joining us today. There's very little time and numerous questions. But if I may, I'd like to start off with Professor Maury Gilbert. Professor Gilbert, you were a pillar of strength while you were held for over 2 years in Iran. So I wanted to acknowledge that, and also wanted to congratulate you on the new book that you have authored, The Uncaged Sky, which is truly incredible, because not only do you talk about your own harrowing experience, but you also share the plight of others who were held arbitrarily in prison in Iran. Given that prison, that your book essentially is a window into the Iranian prison system, is there anyone you'd like to mention today that you expect Canadians and other countries to remain focused on?
Thank you so much for those comments. It's so lovely to hear that. I'm amazed that my book reached the attention of anybody in Canada. So I really appreciate it. As building on what Karim said, Niloufar Bayani is somebody I would absolutely like to mention. She's a Canadian permanent resident. As Karim said, she went to McGill University, where she studied biology and conservation. And she has a lot of connections to Canada. Her entire family are permanent residents there, and still to this day routinely travel to Canada for business purposes as well as seeing family. I also know that the family of Human Jokar, who is another Iranian in this same case, which is, I'll just mention, the same case as Kavus Sayed Emami, the Canadian professor who died under IRGC interrogation, the Persian Wildlife Heritage Foundation group of conservationists who were arrested in 2018 and charged with espionage. So several of them have links to Canada. Human Jokar's family, including his sister, migrated to Canada and citizens of Canada. So several members of this group, not just Professor Sayed Emalmi, who passed away, have links to Canada. Niloufar Bayani, she's a permanent resident. She studied there and returned to Iran to do good in her home country. She only returned for 9 months before being arrested. She also used to work at the UN Environment Program. She has a master's from Columbia University. So she's one of Iran's best and brightest, and is very committed to saving Iran's endangered species, and in particular the big cat species of Iran. She has gone on the record quite bravely as having been not only tortured in prison, but sexually assaulted and sexually harassed on a number of occasions, including as mechanisms to extract a false confession from her, which she has very vocally retracted since then. I really hope that the Canadian Parliament and the Canadian public remember not only Kavus, who was their citizen, but Niloufar Bayani, who is a permanent resident and is still more than 4 years later suffering unjust incarceration in Evin prison.
I'm afraid I'm out of time for more questions.
You had 20 seconds, but it's up to you.
Professor Sajjadpour, you have truly been a font of erudition and insight for many years. There was in Foreign Affairs last month, you say, the Islamic Republic has proved too rigid to bend and too ruthless to break. What are the implications of that for the international community?
In about 3 sentences, please.
Well, thank you. So essentially, this is a regime which has proven incapable of reforming. It's been around for 43 years. It's proven incapable of reforming. My view on it, and this is both the analysis and the policy prescription, is that the fate of the Islamic Republic is going to be similar to that of the Soviet Union.
Thank you.
And so we should think about a U.S. or a Western strategy to, yeah.
My apologies, out of fairness to all the members here. But maybe you can elaborate further. We'll continue on to the Conservative Party, Mr. Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to ask my questions to Mr. Ismailian. I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. You spoke about some level of frustration that you've had in terms of the inaction of the Liberal government in seeing that justice is done for the victims of PS 75255 Canadians, 30 permanent residents. Can you just speak to some of your frustrations, what it has been like engaging with this government, and on the specific issue of designating the IRGC as a terrorist entity, why do you believe the government continues to drag its feet?
Yeah, I can start with the IRGC and the Magnitsky sanctions. We had a meeting with Minister Joly yesterday. With all the family members were invited to the call. And we asked this question several times, why IRGC is not designated as a terrorist organization. And we see like a mysterious resistance to do that. And we have a list of more than 50 people that were involved in shooting down the plane. We have offered that to the government, and nobody has acted to put them in Magnitsky sanctions. As Mr. Shafipour said, the head of police department in Iran at the time of killing Zahra Kazemi, going to the gym, a few hundred meters where my wife and my daughter are buried in Richmond Hill. And this is surprising for us. Why Canada has been a safe haven for the criminals of Islamic Republic of Iran, and for going to an international forum, government is not transparent to us. They don't give us any time frame, and now I think this is a political decision to delay and go to the ICAO, like International Civil Aviation Organization.
Thank you for that, and you spoke about Canada being a safe haven. In that regard, could you elaborate upon IRGC affiliates and their activities within Canada and the security threat that they pose?
You know, the families of the victims, they have faced a lot of threats and intimidation actions from Iranian regime. The families that they live in Canada, and CSIS has prepared a report 2 times this year and last year that the families have been targeted by IRGC. So I can say that the families, they receive phone calls, like messages on different social media platforms, and we have shown that to our CMP and to the other parties, but we haven't seen any action. Nobody has been arrested, and we don't know what they're doing. I know that our CMP has started an investigation about foreign interference, but we are not aware of the outcome of this.
And just going back to your meeting the other day, what was the response of the minister?
She said that she would go back to the cabinet and talk to other ministers and to make a decision about IRGC. So as I said, this is a mystery. We know that 2018, there was a parliamentary motion to put IRGC in a list of terrorist organizations, and they have killed 138 passengers heading to Canada. Could have they done worse than this? I don't know.
30 seconds,
Certainly
Mr. Cooper.
I think the minister could be reminded that she was one of the members of parliament that voted for that motion in 2018, along with the prime minister, and yet no action. Completely unacceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper, for returning a little bit of time. On va continuer avec Monsieur Trudel.
We'll continue with Mr. Trudel from the Bloc Québécois. Thank you, Ms. Shafipour. I have a question. You said in your testimony, using very hard words, that Canada is working for the Iranian government. You spoke about what you had in mind when saying this. People from the Iranian government are living here in Canada, and you are not sure how that can be. Could you please give us some more detail to help us understand what you mean when you say that Canadians are working for the Iranian government?
Please go ahead.
Thanks for your question. I just want to give you an example. My so-called judge was one of those, was listed in 19th person B sanctioned by Canadian government under Magnitsky action. Just imagine he murdered thousands of people, and he destroyed thousands of people's life, and he can freely come to Canada and be your neighbor. he can invest and he invest bloody money and buy, I don't know, many apartments in your neighborhood. I have a specific question from Mr. Trudeau, because I used to be his fan as a kind of just freedom lover. How do you feel if, just for example, Mr. Salavati be your neighbors and the same place in the same apartment you live with your family? It's so weird, you know. I can't understand why Canada just do nothing about that. I don't know how I can explain my feelings. I'm really disappointed.
Dites-moi, en dehors
Except perhaps for prohibiting entry to people from the Iranian government who might end up as our neighbors, what would you like Mr. Trudeau to do? If he was standing in front of you, what would you say to him? What recommendations would you make to him?
You know, as Magus mentioned, it's not about just human rights violation in Iran. It's about Canada's domestic security, and it's a very serious issue. I'm afraid that you remember my words when some disaster happens, and I don't think it's very far from us. There are murderers, there are terrorists. I think that, for example, Canadian government would recognize IRGC as a terrorist when they just murder white people or something like that. I don't know. I don't know. I just it's so weird, and I'm so disappointed. Sorry about that.
Merci, Madame Chafripour.
Thank you. I have 30 seconds left. Professor, I had a question for you, but there's little time. This is a complex question. In your view, what would be the consequences of Iran's association and links to Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq? What are the consequences of those policies?
Just if you can answer very briefly, please.
I didn't hear the translation, but I think I picked it up. What are the consequences of Iran's role in the region? And essentially, Iran's regional proxies constitute an axis of misery. Everywhere that Iran is are failing states, and Iran thrives where there are failing governments, and that's going to continue to be the case.
Thank you. And we'll now move on to our final questioner from the NDP, Ms. McPherson, for 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of the witnesses who are here today. I know how hard this must be. In particular, Mr. Ismailian, to know that you are here, that you are sharing your testimony with us, and you have lost your wife and your daughter. It is heartbreaking. So thank you for continuing to be the voice of the community, continuing to be so strong. As many people will know, many of the victims in that flight were from Edmonton. Many of them were part of the University of Alberta community, and so I feel like we wore a lot of that pain with you. Certainly in 2020, I brought forward a motion in the House. It was given unanimous consent, and it talked about the need for the government to do more to stop the harassment of the victims of 752 in Canada. And that's, I think, one of the things that's most disheartening is I'm not sure that we've seen action on that. So, Mr. Ismailian, I'd love it if you could talk a little bit about that, but also when you met with Minister Joly, you said that there was no roadmap for you, that there was no roadmap for the survivors and no way forward. If you could just talk about what that roadmap would look like for you.
Yeah, the government, thank you for your question. The government has decided to go to International Civil Aviation Organization and ultimately to the International Court of Justice. They have decided to not try International Criminal Court for some reasons that we don't understand. RCMP has decided to not open the criminal case. And but for going to ICAO, they have passed a negotiation phase, and that was futile. On January 5th, that they said that that didn't go anywhere. But now, after 6 months, Minister Joly calls the families and says, okay, now we have decided to go to IKO. And it makes us wonder that what we have done in the last 30 months, if now they want to go for evidence gathering and information gatherings, so it means that for the last 30 months they have wasted the time. And now it was the time to go to IKO. And Iran has its own delayed tactics to not let this case go through IKO in an easy way. MH17 is a good case, and if we have been in IKO several times. We lobby with IKO council members instead of Canadian governments. We know that they do nothing in IKO. We know that Minister of Transportation hasn't done enough in IKO. And this surprises us. The families take the burden of this case in any organization. And the families had to publish a report about this crime, and the governments haven't done enough. In my opinion, I mean, the politicians should not be leaders on this case. They should be followers. The families should be in forefront for decision making, and they're not.
Thank you. So basically, what I'm hearing is that we are hearing delays from the Iranian government, which we expect. But we are also seeing delays from a Canadian government, which is unacceptable, of course. Mr. Ismailian, do you feel in danger in Canada, being the spokesperson, being the voice of the community? Do you feel that you yourself are in danger?
Yes, of course. Not only me, other family members as well. So we have reported to the police. Like a few weeks ago, for instance, I had 2 flat tires on my car when I went to grocery store. So police came and they did some investigation, but the car was not in the range of the cameras, so they closed the case. And I know that the RCMP has opened an investigation, but they don't inform us. They have taken the phone, cell phones a few times to check them, and they don't share anything with us if we are under threats or not. But we see like suspicious cars around our houses. But we don't see much from the government.
We'll have to conclude there, but thank you so much for that. And that was a powerful conclusion to our 2 hours of testimony. On behalf of all the committee members, staff, and those watching, tuning in, we wish you strength to all the witnesses and steadfastness. And to Ms. Moore-Gilbert, we hope that you get some rest. And Mr. Sajidpour, thank you for joining us. Safipour, thank you for being here also. And Mr. Ismailian, we wish you personally strength, and to all the families that you're supporting, our condolences, sincere condolences to all the victims and their families. Thank you. We'll adjourn we will adjourn for half an hour. There will be refreshments here, and see you at 6:30.